Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach our viewers. The hollow silence of the Cumberland Plateau has a way of preserving secrets. In the spring of 1911, the small mining community of Wilder, Tennessee, nestled between the rugged mountains and dense forests of the region, became the setting for one of the most disturbing series of events ever documented in the state's history. What began as a routine labor dispute at the coal mines would spiral into something far more sinister, a darkness that would echo through generations and leave an indelible mark on those who lived to tell the tale. Before we delve into the heart of this disturbing narrative, it's important to understand the context of the time. The early 1900s marked a period of significant industrial growth across America, particularly in regions rich with natural resources. The Cumberland Plateau, with its abundant coal deposits, attracted numerous mining operations. These companies often established entire communities around their mines, creating isolated pockets of civilization where the company controlled nearly every aspect of daily life. Wilder was one such community. Established in 1887 by the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company, the town existed primarily to serve the mining operation. By 1910, its population had grown to nearly 800 people, most of whom were either employed by the mine or provided services to those who were. The company owned the general store, the boarding houses, and even the church building. The miners were paid in scrip rather than U.S. currency, tokens that could only be used at company-owned establishments, effectively binding the workers to the company in a form of economic servitude. Frederick Wilcox, the owner of the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company, was known throughout the region as a shrewd businessman with political connections extending to the state capital in Nashville. Unlike many mine owners of the era who remained distant from their operations, Wilcox maintained a residence in Wilder, a Victorian mansion set apart from the modest miners' cabins, symbolizing the stark class division that characterized the community. It was into this environment that Thomas Simmons arrived in 1901, initially hired as an accountant for the mining operation. What few knew at the time was Simmons's background in medicine. According to records later uncovered from Vanderbilt University, Simmons had completed 3 years of medical training before abruptly withdrawing from the program in 1899. His academic file contains a cryptic note from the Dean of Medicine stating, "Mr. Simmons's departure is mutually agreed upon following concerns regarding his unorthodox research interests and experimental methodology." The Simmons family homestead stood at the edge of Wilder, a weathered 2-story structure built in the 1880s, its timber frame creaking with each gust of wind that swept through the valley. Thomas Simmons, eventually promoted to mine foreman, had lived there with his wife Margaret for nearly 10 years by 1911. By all accounts, they were upstanding members of the community, regular churchgoers, hospitable neighbors, and fixtures at local gatherings. Thomas was known for his fair treatment of the miners under his supervision, a rarity in those harsh times of labor exploitation. Ezekiel Johnson, who worked as a miner in Wilder from 1903 until 1916, recalled in a 1957 oral history, "Simmons wasn't like the other bosses. He treated us with respect, asked after our families. He had this way of listening that made you feel he was genuinely interested. But there was something about his eyes that wasn't quite right, like he was studying you, the way a scientist might examine a specimen. It didn't feel malicious exactly, just different." Margaret Simmons, by contrast, was remembered as warm and gregarious, though several accounts mention her becoming increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to the couple's disappearance. She had arrived in Wilder as a new bride in 1901, the daughter of a Nashville physician with connections to Vanderbilt University. According to church records, she taught Sunday school and organized a women's literary society that met weekly in the Simmons home. Yet, according to county records obtained decades later, there were discrepancies in the official narrative that surrounded the family. Employment logs from the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company showed that Thomas had been briefly dismissed in 1909, only to be rehired 6 months later with a promotion. No reason was documented for either the dismissal or the subsequent favorable treatment. When interviewed in 1962, former company secretary Eliza Watkins noted, "There were whispers about Simmons having leverage over Mr. Wilcox, the mine owner. Something about knowledge that wasn't meant to be shared." During his 6-month absence from the company, Simmons's whereabouts remained a mystery to the townsfolk. However, travel records from the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, uncovered during a 1970 historical survey, showed that during this period he purchased tickets to Chicago, New York, and Boston, all cities with prominent medical research institutions. What business Simmons conducted in these locations remains unknown, but upon his return to Wilder, witnesses reported multiple deliveries of large, heavy crates to the Simmons residence. The winter of 1910 to 1911 had been particularly harsh in Tennessee. Heavy snowfall had isolated many communities, and Wilder was no exception. Food supplies dwindled, and tensions rose among the miners as wages were cut while working hours increased. The company store raised prices, driving many families into deeper debt. According to local newspaper archives, it was during this period that the first disappearances were noted, not reported as such, but rather mentioned in passing. James Farley has not been seen at his post for 3 days, read a small notice in the Wilder Weekly Chronicle from January 23, 1911. Similar notices followed for 2 other miners in February. What these brief notices failed to capture was the unusual pattern of the disappearances. According to a private journal kept by Dr. Morris Lieberman, the company physician, all 3 missing men had recently visited him with identical complaints: severe headaches, insomnia, and what they described as sounds that shouldn't be there. Dr. Lieberman's journal entry from February 8, 1911 reads, "Third case this month presenting with identical neurological symptoms. No physical cause evident. All 3 men worked in the new shaft, the one extending beneath the north ridge. Curious coincidence, mentioned my observations to Mr. Wilcox, who seemed oddly unsurprised and suggested exhaustion as the likely culprit. I remain unconvinced. A report filed by the local sheriff's office discovered in 1960 during a routine archiving of county records indicated that Deputy Sheriff Landon Parker had conducted a cursory investigation into Farley's absence. His notes mentioned visiting Farley's small cabin on the outskirts of Wilder, finding it in good order, though with a peculiar odor I cannot place. The deputy concluded that Farley had likely moved on to seek employment elsewhere, a common occurrence during those difficult economic times. The case was closed without further inquiry. What Deputy Parker failed to include in his official report, but later confided to his grandson according to a 1963 oral history project conducted by Vanderbilt University, was that he had found Farley's most prized possessions still in the cabin: a pocket watch inherited from his father and a pair of new work boots he had saved months to purchase. No man, especially one of modest means, would voluntarily leave such items behind. The grandson's account continues with a detail never officially recorded. Grandfather said he found a strange drawing pinned to the wall behind Farley's bed. It showed what looked like a network of tunnels, but with unusual symbols at various intersections. When he showed it to the mine superintendent, the man turned white as a sheet and snatched the paper away, saying it was company property. The next day, Grandfather found himself removed from the case, with explicit instructions from the sheriff to leave company business to the company. By late February, as the harsh winter showed no signs of relenting, an atmosphere of unease had settled over Wilder. The mining company's ledgers, partially preserved in the state archives, show a marked increase in workplace accidents during this period. Miners reported unusual sounds echoing through the deeper shafts, sounds that some described as mechanical and others as almost like whispering. Company physician Dr. Howard Blackwood documented an increase in miners reporting symptoms of nervous exhaustion and disturbed sleep patterns. Jeremiah Sullivan, one of the few miners who would later speak openly about this period, described the atmosphere in a 1966 interview with the Tennessee Historical Commission. It wasn't just the cold or the hunger or the long hours that wore on us that winter. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. Men would come up from the deep shafts acting strange, jumpy one minute, eerily calm the next. Some refused to go back down, even knowing they'd lose their jobs. We started hearing stories about a new tunnel they'd found, one that wasn't on any of the maps. The company men sealed it up right quick, but not before some of the fellows heard things coming from inside it. A particularly telling entry in Dr. Blackwood's medical journal, dated February 27, 1911, reads, "Examined Samuel Reeves today. Third miner this month to report identical symptoms, persistent headaches, visual disturbances, and what he describes as a feeling of being watched. Physical examination reveals nothing unusual. Beginning to wonder if some sort of coal gas might be present in the lower levels of Shaft 7. Have advised Mr. Wilcox to have the area tested, though he seems dismissive of these concerns." What Dr. Blackwood didn't know, but what would later be revealed through Frederick Wilcox's private correspondence uncovered in 1975, was that Wilcox had indeed ordered tests of the air quality in Shaft 7. A letter dated March 1, 1911, from the Pittsburgh Mining Consultancy reports. Air samples show normal composition with no toxic gases present in significant quantities. However, we note the unusual acoustic properties of the shaft in question. Our engineer reports that certain frequencies appear to be amplified by the natural rock formations, creating standing wave patterns of remarkable stability. This phenomenon might account for the auditory disturbances reported by your workers. We recommend either reinforcing the shaft walls with sound-dampening materials or abandoning this section entirely. Wilcox's response, preserved as a draft in his papers, is particularly revealing. Your findings confirm Simmons's theory regarding the unique acoustic properties of the limestone formations. Please forward all testing equipment as requested and maintain strict confidentiality regarding your observations. The potential applications extend far beyond mining safety. By March, as the snow began to thaw and the roads cleared, the situation in Wilder had reached a breaking point. A labor strike seemed imminent. The miners, pushed to their limits by harsh conditions and unexplained events, had begun organizing secret meetings. It was during this time that local residents reported strange occurrences at the Simmons property. Lights burning until dawn. The sound of hammering late into the night. Margaret Simmons, once a fixture at community gatherings, hadn't been seen in public for weeks. Cordelia Massey, who served as the town's postmistress for over 30 years, recalled in a 1956 interview that Margaret had stopped collecting their mail in early February. When I saw Thomas, I asked after her health. He told me she was suffering from a nervous condition and needed rest. There was something in his manner that troubled me, a coldness in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. I remember thinking it odd that a man so concerned with his wife's health would look almost pleased when speaking of her illness. Another neighbor, Edith Carpenter, reported seeing Thomas carrying what appeared to be heavy medical equipment into the house late at night. "It was near midnight, and I was up with my colicky baby," she recalled in a statement given to Eleanor Hayes in 1958. "I saw Mr. Simmons struggling with a large brass contraption. It looked something like a phonograph horn, but much larger, with all manner of tubes and gauges attached to it. When he saw me watching from my window, he hurriedly covered it with a blanket. The next morning he brought over a jar of honey and made a peculiar point of mentioning how soundly he and Mrs. Simmons had slept. On the morning of March 17, 1911, Thomas Simmons arrived at the mine office, reportedly looking haggard and unwashed. According to statements given by clerk Howard Jenkins to the Cumberland County Historical Society in 1958, Simmons demanded a private meeting with owner Frederick Wilcox. The two men were locked in Wilcox's office for over 2 hours. When they emerged, witnesses described both men as pale and visibly shaken. That same afternoon, Wilcox announced unexpectedly generous concessions to the miners' demands: a 20% wage increase, reduced hours, and lower prices at the company's store. The sudden reversal of the company's labor policies caught everyone by surprise. The miners, while relieved to have their demands met without a strike, were nevertheless suspicious of the timing. Adding to the mystery was Wilcox's unprecedented decision to close the mine entirely for 3 days, citing necessary infrastructure repairs. During this closure, several witnesses reported seeing company wagons transporting large, tarpaulin-covered objects from the main shaft to an unknown destination in the dead of night. Jenkins, who had worked for the mining company for over 15 years at that point, would later confide to his daughter that he had overheard fragments of the heated conversation between Simmons and Wilcox. "It wasn't about the miners or their conditions," he reportedly said. Simmons kept saying, "It's evolving beyond our control," and "the parameters have been exceeded." Wilcox responded at one point, "For God's sake, man, shut it down then," to which Simmons replied, "It's far too late for that." What truly transpired during that private meeting remains one of the central mysteries of the case. However, a fragment of what might have been discussed was discovered in 2010 when renovation workers at the old company headquarters found a dictation cylinder that had fallen behind a cabinet. When played on restored equipment, it contained approximately 2 minutes of a conversation between two men identified by audio experts as likely being Simmons and Wilcox. The recording, partially degraded, includes the following exchange. Simmons: "Frequency has stabilized at 18.9 Hz. The effect is consistent across all test subjects." Wilcox: "And you're certain this is what's causing the phenomena in Shaft 7, Simmons?" "Not causing, Frederick, revealing. The frequency acts as a sort of perceptual gateway. It allows the human mind to perceive what is already there, but normally filtered out by our sensory limitations." Wilcox: "Those miners weren't just hallucinating then." Simmons: "Quite the opposite. They were experiencing a heightened state of perception. The question is not what they were seeing, but what is always there, watching us, just beyond the threshold of normal awareness." The recording ends abruptly at this point. Attempts to authenticate it have yielded inconclusive results, though the Tennessee State Archives maintains it in their collection of Wilder Mining Company artifacts. 3 days later, Thomas Simmons didn't report to work. When a colleague was sent to check on him, he found the Simmons homestead empty. No signs of struggle, no notes left behind. The stove was cold. 2 plates with half-eaten breakfast sat on the kitchen table, now covered in a thin layer of dust. In the main bedroom, the bed was made, clothes were neatly hung in the wardrobe, and Margaret's hairbrush still had strands of her dark hair entwined in its bristles. The colleague, William Hargrove, later described finding one additional detail that never made it into the official report: a small leather notebook open on Thomas's desk with a single line written in what appeared to be Margaret's handwriting: "They're coming through now. God help us." The disappearance caused little initial concern. Many assumed the couple had simply relocated, perhaps to Nashville or Knoxville, where opportunities were more plentiful. Yet no one recalled seeing them leave. No wagons or carriages were hired. Their personal belongings remained untouched. It was as if they had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. An entry in the Wildertown Registry, dated March 25, 1911, notes simply, "Simmons property vacant. T. Simmons employment terminated by mutual agreement, according to F. Wilcox." No further official mention of the couple appears in any public records for several months. It would later emerge through documents uncovered during a 1957 tax audit, that Frederick Wilcox had quietly purchased the Simmons property on March 22, 1911, just 2 days after their disappearance, for a sum considerably above its market value. The transaction was processed through a Nashville law firm with no local connections, effectively obscuring the change in ownership from community knowledge. In the days following the Simmons disappearance, miners reported that Shaft 7, the site of the previous unusual occurrences, had been completely sealed off with concrete and heavy timbers. A new company policy strictly prohibited any discussion of that section of the mine, with termination, the stated consequence for violations. The missing miners were never mentioned again in any official capacity. A curious entry in Frederick Wilcox's personal ledger, discovered during the 1957 audit, shows a payment of $5,000, equivalent to over $130,000 in today's currency, to a Dr. Elliot Warburton of the Institute for Advanced Acoustic Research, an organization that, according to subsequent investigations, never existed in any official capacity. The payment is dated March 21, 1911, just 1 day after the Simmons disappearance. Weeks passed, and the improved working conditions at the mine had mollified the workers enough that few questions were asked about the former foreman's whereabouts. Frederick Wilcox, when questioned, merely stated that Thomas had tendered his resignation and was seeking opportunities elsewhere. The matter might have been forgotten entirely if not for what happened on the night of April 30, 1911. A tremendous storm swept through the Cumberland Plateau that evening. Lightning struck the abandoned Simmons property, igniting a fire in the eastern wing of the house. Volunteer firefighters from Wilder managed to contain the blaze before it consumed the entire structure, but not before significant damage had been done to the rear portion of the home. It was during the cleanup the following morning that the first troubling discovery was made. Behind a false wall in what had once been a pantry, firefighters discovered a hidden doorway leading to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. According to the official report filed by Fire Captain William Donnelly, none of the men present had been aware of the existence of this subterranean space. Armed with lanterns, Donnelly and 2 volunteers descended the stairs. What they found was described in deliberately vague terms in the official record. A room containing items of a disturbing nature was the extent of the documentation. However, personal journals kept by Donnelly, discovered after his death in 1937, painted a far more unsettling picture. The hidden basement contained a table bolted to the floor with leather restraints attached to each corner. The walls were lined with crude shelves holding jars of unidentifiable substances. A desk in the corner held a leather-bound journal, allegedly belonging to Thomas Simmons, filled with entries dating back to 1902. Donnelly's journal entry from May 1, 1911 reads, "I have instructed the men who accompanied me to speak nothing of what we witnessed. Some things are best left buried." The contents of Simmons's journal suggest a man whose mind had long since departed from the shores of sanity. References to the purification process and vessels of the divine experiment appear repeatedly. Most disturbing were the detailed sketches of human anatomy with annotations that I dare not describe even in this private account. What Donnelly's public account omitted, but his private journal revealed, was the discovery of what appeared to be a sophisticated recording apparatus in one corner of the hidden room. The device, advanced for its time, consisted of a modified phonograph with additional components of unknown purpose. Attached to it was a brass plate engraved with the words, "Harmonics of the Threshold." Several dozen wax recording cylinders were neatly arranged on a nearby shelf, each labeled with only a date and a number. Donnelly apparently removed one of these cylinders before reporting the discovery to authorities. His journal entry continues, "I have brought cylinder 17 home with me. God forgive me for this theft, but something compels me to understand what drove Simmons to create such a place beneath his respectable home. Tonight, when the house is quiet, I shall listen to what he recorded." The next entry, dated May 2, 1911, consists of only a single line. I will destroy the cylinder at first light. Some sounds were never meant for human ears. Donnelly's wife, Martha, would later report to their son that on the night of May 1st, her husband locked himself in his study with the mysterious cylinder and what she presumed was a phonograph borrowed from a neighbor. Shortly after midnight, she was awakened by a scream, followed by the sound of breaking glass. When she rushed to the study, she found her husband sitting motionless at his desk, staring at the wall. The phonograph lay in pieces on the floor. When she spoke to him, he didn't respond for several minutes, and then asked, "Did you hear them too?" He refused to explain what he meant and forbade her from ever mentioning the incident again. Donnelly would serve as fire captain for another 26 years, but according to family members, he was never quite the same after that night. He developed an intense fear of the dark, sleeping only during daylight hours when possible, and keeping multiple lamps burning throughout the night. He refused to enter caves or mines and reportedly stuffed cotton in his ears during thunderstorms, claiming certain sounds in the thunder might carry messages. Within days, the fire-damaged Simmons property was demolished by order of Frederick Wilcox, who had apparently purchased the deed shortly after the couple's disappearance. The rubble was cleared and the foundation was filled in with soil and gravel. A small park was established on the site, ostensibly as a gesture of goodwill toward the mining community. During the demolition, according to an account provided by laborer Joseph Winters in a 1953 interview, workers uncovered what appeared to be a network of pipes extending from the hidden basement room into the surrounding soil. They weren't normal water or gas pipes, Winters recalled. They were made of some kind of copper alloy, and they had these strange bulbous chambers at irregular intervals. Mr. Wilcox had us remove them all and load them onto a company wagon. Never said where they were taking them, but he was mighty particular that we find every last one. One of these pipes, reportedly broken off during extraction, was secretly kept by Winters as a curiosity. In 1964, his grandson donated it to the Tennessee State Museum, where metallurgical analysis revealed it to be made of an unusual copper-nickel alloy with acoustic properties unlike standard plumbing materials. Most notable was its interior design, which featured a spiral pattern etched into the metal at precise intervals, a design that acoustic engineers concluded would selectively amplify certain sound frequencies while dampening others. For nearly 2 decades, the events surrounding the Simmons disappearance faded from public memory. Wilder continued to operate as a coal mining town, though production gradually decreased as more accessible seams were exhausted. By the late 1920s, many of the original miners had moved on, taking with them the oral history of those strange days in 1911. Yet subtle changes in the community were noted by outsiders. A 1922 report by a traveling public health physician noted that Wilder residents showed an unusually high incidence of melancholic disposition and nervousness. Local church attendance declined sharply. The school reported increasing difficulty maintaining student focus. By 1925, the once thriving community had diminished to less than half its former population, despite the continued operation of the mines. Frederick Wilcox sold his controlling interest in the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company in 1921 and relocated to Boston, where he established the Wilcox Foundation for Acoustic Research. The Foundation's official mission was advancing the understanding of sound and its applications in architectural and medical contexts. However, according to financial records uncovered in the 1980s, much of its funding went toward grants to researchers studying infrasonic influences on neurological states and acoustic gateways to altered perception. It wasn't until 1929 that the case resurfaced in an unexpected way. A geology student from Vanderbilt University, Robert Thornton, was conducting research on the unique limestone formations of the Cumberland Plateau. While exploring an unmarked cave system approximately 3 miles east of Wilder, Thornton made a startling discovery. Deep within the cavern, in a chamber that showed signs of human modification, he found evidence of habitation. Kerosene lamps, preserved food supplies, and basic furniture suggested someone had lived, or at least spent significant time, in this remote location. Most notably, Thornton recovered a metal box containing personal effects, a pocket watch inscribed with the initials T.S., a woman's wedding band, and several pages of handwritten notes. The notes, partially damaged by moisture, contained fragmented thoughts that Thornton later connected to Thomas Simmons after researching local history. References to the failure of the experiment at home and the necessity of continuing my work in isolation painted a picture of a man who had deliberately gone into hiding. Thornton's field journal, preserved in the Vanderbilt University archives, contains detailed sketches of the cave chamber and its modifications. Most striking were his drawings of unusual markings carved into the cave walls, geometric patterns of remarkable precision that Thornton noted appeared to have been created with scientific instruments rather than crude tools. He described one section of the wall as covered in mathematical equations and what appear to be acoustic formulas, though their purpose eludes me. In a particularly haunting passage, Thornton wrote, "The patterns seem designed to create specific resonance, patterns when sound waves interact with them. Most curious is that when I whistle a sustained note near certain configurations, the returning echo seems to contain harmonics not present in the original sound, as if the patterns themselves are adding frequencies to the acoustic environment." In the deepest part of the modified chamber, Thornton discovered what he described as a listening post of some kind. His notes describe a chair positioned in front of a natural chimney in the rock, modified with the same copper alloy pipes found at the Simmons house. The pipes converged at a contraption positioned at ear height to someone seated in the chair. Thornton's journal entry reads, "The entire apparatus appears designed to channel or perhaps amplify sounds from deep within the cave system. But what sounds could be of such interest as to warrant this elaborate setup in such an inhospitable location?" What Thornton found most disturbing, according to his journal, was not the equipment itself, but the state in which he found it. The chair shows signs of having been occupied recently, within days, not years. The lantern contained oil. Food supplies are not deteriorated, yet I have encountered no one in 3 days of exploration. If someone is living in these caves, they are either deeper within the system than I have ventured, or they have vacated temporarily, perhaps aware of my presence. Thornton reported his findings to local authorities, but by 1929, few people remained in the area who remembered the Simmons case. His discovery was relegated to a brief mention in the Nashville Tennessean and filed away in the county records office. Thornton himself continued his academic career, eventually becoming a professor of geology at the University of Tennessee. In a 1952 interview for an academic journal, he reflected on the experience. "I have explored caves across 5 continents, but nothing has ever affected me as profoundly as what I found in that Tennessee cavern. There was something in the atmosphere, a sense of wrongness that I've never been able to adequately describe. Science doesn't have a vocabulary for that kind of feeling." What Thornton did not include in his official reports, but confided to a colleague, according to correspondence preserved in the university archives, was that he had spent one night in the modified chamber out of scientific curiosity. His letter, dated August 12, 1929, states, "I regret to inform you that I will be taking a leave of absence from our planned expedition to the Blue Ridge formations. My experience in the Cumberland site has left me with a persistent auditory disturbance that makes fieldwork impossible at present. The university physician diagnoses it as tinnitus, but no medical explanation accounts for the distinct patterns I perceive in the noise, almost like a code or language just beyond the threshold of comprehension." In a follow-up letter dated September 3, 1929, Thornton wrote, "The sounds continue unabated. I find myself unconsciously pressing my ear to walls, particularly in quiet rooms, as if expecting to hear something responding from the other side. Most troubling is that I've begun to understand fragments of what I'm hearing, not in any conventional linguistic sense, but as concepts that form directly in my mind. They are asking questions about us, about our world. They want to know if we're ready. Thornton would go on to make significant contributions to the field of geology, but colleagues noted that he never returned to cave exploration and refused to discuss his Tennessee findings in his later years. His personal papers, donated to Vanderbilt after his death in 1967, included a sealed envelope labeled Wilder Cave Personal. University archivists report that this envelope disappeared from their collections sometime in the early 1970s. No investigation into its removal was ever conducted. The case might have remained closed if not for the efforts of investigative journalist Eleanor Hayes in the late 1950s. While researching a series of articles on Appalachian mining communities, Hayes stumbled upon references to the Simmons disappearance. Intrigued, she began to piece together the fragmented narrative through county records, newspaper archives, and interviews with elderly residents who still remembered those days. What Hayes uncovered suggested a conspiracy of silence that had effectively buried the truth for nearly 5 decades. According to her notes, published posthumously in 1968, she managed to locate an individual who claimed to have worked as a house servant for the Wilcox family in 1911. This source, identified only as MJ, provided a troubling account of the relationship between Thomas Simmons and Frederick Wilcox. They weren't just business associates, MJ reportedly told Hayes. They were involved in something else, something Mr. Wilcox called the research. I overheard them late one night in Mr. Wilcox's study. They spoke of advancing human understanding and breaking the limitations of consciousness. Mr. Simmons seemed to be the one with the knowledge, but Mr. Wilcox provided the resources and protection. MJ also described strange deliveries to the Wilcox estate in the months preceding the Simmons disappearance. Large wooden crates would arrive by private wagon, always after dark. The men would unload them directly into the cellar through the exterior doors. Once, I glimpsed the contents of a smaller package, glass tubes and brass fittings, like something from a scientific laboratory. When I asked about them, Mr. Wilcox dismissed me for the day. The next morning, he increased my wages by 20% without explanation. Perhaps most disturbing was MJ's account of the changes in Wilcox's behavior following the Simmons disappearance. He became obsessed with silence, had the entire mansion retrofitted with cork insulation between the walls. No clocks were allowed to chime. He would sit for hours in his study with a strange brass device held to his ear like a doctor's stethoscope, but connected to a box with dials. Sometimes he would suddenly write furiously in his notebook, as if taking dictation. Once I entered the room unexpectedly, and he was speaking to an empty chair, nodding and responding to questions I couldn't hear. Hayes's investigation led her to the discovery of financial records showing that between 1902 and 1911, Frederick Wilcox had made substantial payments to medical supply companies in Philadelphia and Chicago. These companies specialized in equipment typically used by teaching hospitals and research institutions. Why such items would be shipped to a remote mining town in Tennessee remained unexplained. Perhaps most disturbing was Hayes's discovery of death certificates for 3 miners who had reportedly left Wilder for other opportunities in early 1911. All 3 certificates had been filed in counties at least 100 miles from Wilder. All listed natural causes, despite the men being under 40 years of age, and all had been signed by different physicians who, upon later investigation, could not be verified as ever having practiced medicine in those counties. In the summer of 1959, Hayes made a significant breakthrough. Through persistent research, she located the whereabouts of Margaret Simmons's younger sister, Constance Wheeler, who was living in a boarding house in Knoxville. Though elderly and in poor health, Wheeler agreed to an interview. What she revealed cast the entire case in a new and disturbing light. According to Wheeler, her sister's marriage to Thomas Simmons had been a happy one initially. Thomas had been a medical student at Vanderbilt University, but had abandoned his studies after becoming fascinated with what he called the frontiers of human consciousness. Unable to pursue his interests within the confines of traditional medicine, he had taken the position at the Wheeler Mine, where he met Frederick Wilcox, a man who shared his unorthodox interests. Thomas believed that the human mind functioned like a receiver, Wheeler explained to Hayes. He thought our normal perception filtered out vast portions of reality to make existence comprehensible. His research focused on finding ways to temporarily disable those filters, to allow the mind to perceive what he called the fuller spectrum of existence. He was particularly interested in sound as a gateway. He believed certain acoustic frequencies could attune the mind to aspects of reality that normally remain imperceptible. Wheeler claimed that in the years leading up to 1911, Margaret had become increasingly concerned about her husband's activities. In letters to her sister, she described strange sounds coming from the basement at night, and Thomas's growing obsession with testing the thresholds of perception. Most troublingly, she mentioned visitors who arrived under cover of darkness, men with academic credentials who engaged in lengthy discussions with Thomas behind closed doors. Wheeler shared with Hayes fragments of letters she had received from Margaret between 1908 and 1911. In one dated October 1908, Margaret wrote, "Thomas speaks constantly of his breakthrough, though he shares little of the specifics with me. He says it's for my protection. What troubles me most is the change in him. He barely sleeps, and when he does, he wakes shouting about the space between sounds. Last night I found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m, pressing his ear against the wall and writing furiously in his notebook. A letter from July 1909 reads, "The men from the university visited again. They spoke with Thomas for hours in his study. When they left, one of them looked so pale I thought he might faint on our porch." Thomas was elated afterward. He said they had finally begun to understand the implications of his work. He mentioned something about acoustic gateways and the mathematics of liminality. I pretend to understand to keep him talking, but his ideas have moved beyond my comprehension. In a particularly troubling letter from December 1910, Margaret wrote, "Thomas has convinced me to participate in what he calls controlled exposure. He has prepared a room in the basement where he claims the conditions are ideal for perception of the phenomenon he's been studying. I have agreed, primarily to ease his growing paranoia, that I don't believe in his work. The process involves sitting in complete darkness while wearing a device he has constructed that covers the ears and eyes. I am to report anything I perceive that seems unusual. Thus far, I've experienced nothing beyond the expected sensations of sensory deprivation, mild disorientation, increased awareness of my own heartbeat, and occasionally phantom sounds that I recognize as creations of my own mind seeking stimulation." Thomas seems disappointed, but assures me that with repeated sessions, my perception will attune to what he calls the frequency. The last letter Wheeler received from her sister was dated March 15, 1911, just days before the couple's disappearance. It contained a single disturbing sentence. "If anything should happen to me, know that it began the night Thomas discovered the effects of isolation on the human mind." Wheeler also revealed to Hayes that she had attempted to visit Wilder after receiving no further correspondence from her sister. "I arrived in late April, only to find their house damaged by fire and being demolished. When I asked in town, people avoided my questions. Mr. Wilcox agreed to meet with me briefly. He ended our meeting abruptly, but not before offering me a considerable sum to help with my travels home. I refused the money, and that evening the sheriff personally escorted me to the train station, claiming there had been incidents of harassment toward outsiders. What Wheeler had not shared with Hayes, but later confided to her nephew according to a family account recorded in 1972, was that during her brief stay in Wilder, she had experienced a series of disturbing auditory phenomena. He claimed Thomas and Margaret had moved to Colorado for Margaret's health, but could provide no forwarding address. When I mentioned my sister's troubling final letter, something changed in his manner. At night, in my room at the boarding house, I would hear what sounded like my sister's voice, though the words were indistinct. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. When I pressed my ear against the plaster, the voice became clearer, but what I heard made no sense. Margaret reciting strings of numbers and unfamiliar terms as if reading from a technical document. On my final night in town, the voice changed. It spoke directly to me using my childhood nickname that only Margaret knew. It said, "Connie, we found a door, but it opens both ways." Hayes attempted to pursue this lead further, but her investigation came to an abrupt end. In October 1959, while driving to meet with a former miner who claimed to have information about secret tunnels beneath the Wilder mines, her car veered off a mountain road. The crash was ruled an accident, though some locals noted the lack of skid marks at the scene. Hayes' notes and research materials, which she reportedly kept with her at all times, were never recovered. A curious footnote to Hayes' death emerged 15 years later, when a retired Tennessee state trooper, William Carver, came forward with an alternative account. In a sworn affidavit, Carver claimed he had been part of the emergency response team at Hayes' accident. There was no damage to the steering components of her vehicle, as the official report claimed, his statement read. Moreover, her research materials were not missing. They were removed from the scene by men identifying themselves as federal agents before the local sheriff even arrived. When I questioned this, my supervisor informed me that the matter was above our jurisdiction. Even more disturbing was Carver's description of Hayes' personal effects recovered from the vehicle. Among her belongings was a small brass device, unlike anything I had seen before. It resembled an ear trumpet connected to a series of tubes and small mechanical components. Attached to it was a tag labeled TS Original Prototype, a tuning device. One of the federal agents reacted visibly when he saw it, immediately securing it in a lead-lined case they had brought with them. I distinctly recall him saying to his colleague, "It's still active." The story might have ended there if not for an unexpected development in 1962. During the construction of a new dam by the Tennessee Valley Authority, workers uncovered a sealed entrance to an abandoned mine shaft not documented in any official records. Inside, authorities found evidence of what appeared to be an improvised laboratory. Equipment of medical and scientific nature, much of it dating back to the early 1900s, suggested sophisticated research had once been conducted in this isolated location. TVA engineer Raymond Huff, who led the initial inspection of the site, provided a detailed inventory that was subsequently classified by federal authorities. However, before the classification order took effect, portions of his report were seen by local newspaper reporter Samuel Godfrey. According to Godfrey's unpublished notes, later acquired by the Tennessee State Archives, the hidden laboratory contained specialized acoustic equipment, including early microphones and recording devices modified in unusual ways. Huff's report allegedly described one room in the hidden facility as being completely lined with a material resembling cork, but with different acoustic properties. Within this room was a chair bolted to the floor, facing a large brass horn protruding from the wall. Attached to the chair were crude monitoring devices apparently designed to record pulse, respiration, and possibly other physiological responses. One worker involved in the excavation, who requested anonymity when interviewed in 1980 for a documentary on Appalachian mining history, described finding what appeared to be a journal detailing experiments conducted in the facility. It listed test subjects by number, not name. Each entry documented how long the subject was exposed to something called the frequency and their reported experiences. The entries started out clinical, like a proper scientific study, but became increasingly strange. Later pages contained drawings that made no anatomical sense, like human forms, but with proportions all wrong and extra features that don't exist in nature. The final pages were filled with the same phrase written over and over. "They're coming through." Most disturbing was the discovery of a leather-bound journal bearing the name Thomas Simmons on the inside cover. Only fragments of this journal have ever been made public, as Tennessee state authorities quickly classified most of the material. Those pages that were revealed described experiments focused on what Simmons called the architecture of fear and mapping the geography of human dread. He wrote of volunteers from among the miners who participated in experiments involving extended periods of sensory deprivation, exposure to carefully calibrated environmental conditions, and the administration of compounds derived from local flora. One particularly troubling entry, dated January 1911, read, "Subject 17 exhibited the most promising response to date. After 72 hours of complete darkness and controlled sound exposure, he reported the manifestation of what he described as the presence. Upon further questioning, he could not articulate whether this presence originated from within his own mind or from some external source. The boundaries between internal and external reality have begun to dissolve, exactly as theorized. Progress continues." Another entry, dated February 1911, contains what appears to be a breakthrough moment in Simmons's research. The frequency has been isolated. 18.9 Hertz, modulated at precise intervals with its third harmonic, creates the psychoacoustic conditions necessary for the effect. When combined with the sensory deprivation protocol, the results are consistently reproducible. The subjects universally report the sensation of being watched, followed by auditory hallucinations that bear remarkable similarities despite no communication between test participants. Most significant is the consistent report of whispers in a language I almost understand. This suggests we are not creating the phenomenon, but rather establishing the perceptual conditions necessary to experience something that exists independent of the observer. One of the last entries made public, dated March 10, 1911, shows a marked shift in tone. M has begun to hear them without the apparatus. This confirms my suspicion that once the perceptual gateway is opened, it cannot be fully closed again. She reports that they speak to her primarily at night, describing what they call the other side. Most troubling is her insistence that they are making preparations. When I ask for what purpose, she only says, "To come through." I have increased her sedation, but it seems to make little difference. The voices, she claims, are not entering through her ears, but directly into her mind. The final dated entry in the public portions of the journal was from March 16, 1911, the day before Thomas Simmons' final meeting with Frederick Wilcox and just 4 days before the couple's disappearance. It contained only a brief note. M has discovered the true nature of the work. All is compromised. The only option is to continue elsewhere, away from scrutiny. Wilcox will ensure our safe passage. What remained unexplained in the journal was the purpose behind Simmons's experiments. Was he merely documenting the psychological effects of extreme conditions on the human mind, or was there some deeper objective? The classified portions of the journal might hold these answers, but they remain inaccessible to the public even decades later. In the aftermath of the laboratory's discovery, the TVA accelerated its timeline for flooding the valley, citing structural concerns that necessitated immediate action. Within weeks, the site was submerged beneath the waters of the new reservoir, effectively sealing away whatever secrets remained in the hidden facility. In the decades since these discoveries, the case has remained officially unsolved. What exactly happened to Thomas and Margaret Simmons remains unknown. Were they victims, perpetrators? Did they flee, or did they meet a more sinister fate? The demolition of their home, the disappearance of key evidence, and the deaths of those who investigated the case have ensured that the complete truth may never be known. However, local folklore in the Cumberland Plateau region has preserved aspects of the story in distorted form. Residents speak of the Wilder experiments and warn against exploring certain cave systems in the area. Some claim that on particularly still nights, in the vicinity where the Simmons home once stood, a persistent tapping sound can be heard, as if someone is sending a message from deep underground. A recurring element in these local stories is the concept of threshold listeners, individuals who, after spending time in certain caves in the region, develop an unusual sensitivity to sounds others cannot perceive. According to these tales, such people eventually begin to hear the voices from the other side, though what lies on this other side is never clearly articulated. Many of these listeners reportedly become reclusive, spending hours in silence with their ears pressed to walls or the ground as if waiting for some specific sound or message. Local resident Harlan McKinney, interviewed in 1983 for a regional folklore collection, described his grandfather's experience. Grandpa worked in the Wilder mine back in 1911, though he rarely spoke of it. In his final years, he developed peculiar habits. He built a small wooden structure in the backyard. Just a box, really, barely large enough for a man to sit in. He would spend hours inside it, in complete darkness. When I asked him why, he said it was the only place quiet enough to hear them clearly. Who them was, he wouldn't say. The night before he died, I found him sitting in that box, smiling like I'd never seen before. "They're coming for me tomorrow," he said. "They promised to show me the other side." He passed in his sleep that night. The doctor called it natural causes, but there was nothing natural about the expression frozen on his face, a mixture of terror and ecstasy that still haunts me. Perhaps the most unsettling postscript to the case came in 1968, during the final cataloging of materials recovered from the hidden laboratory. Among the items was a sealed metal container, heavily corroded but intact. When opened by TVA officials, it was found to contain dozens of audio recording cylinders, an early form of sound recording popular in the early 1900s. When played on appropriate equipment, the cylinders revealed a series of sessions conducted by Thomas Simmons. The quality was poor, but the content was clear enough. Individuals describing in monotonous detail their experiences during what Simmons called controlled isolation. One recording, labeled simply M Final Session, contained a woman's voice, presumably Margaret's. The transcript, released through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1979, is as follows. "I've been in the dark now for, I've lost track of time. Thomas says that's part of the process. The dismantling of temporal awareness. I agreed to this because I wanted to understand his work, to share in what consumes him so. But now I understand too much. There is something here in the darkness with me, not physical, not entirely. It exists in the space created when the mind can no longer distinguish between what is real and what is imagined." Thomas calls it a breakthrough, says we're mapping uncharted territory of human consciousness, but I call it something else. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and I fear what might come through. The recording ends abruptly, followed by several minutes of silence, and then what sound analysts described as movement and muffled conversation between at least two individuals. What makes this recording particularly disturbing is its date stamp, March 19, 1911, one day before the Simmons reported disappearance. If authentic, it suggests that Margaret was not a willing participant in her husband's relocation, but rather a subject in his final experiment. In 1972, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a psychoacoustics researcher at MIT, was granted limited access to some of the Simmons recordings for scientific analysis. Her findings, published in an obscure academic journal before apparently being withdrawn from circulation, described anomalies in the audio that defied conventional explanation. Beneath the audible content of the recordings, she wrote, exists a consistent subharmonic pattern that appears to have been deliberately engineered. This pattern operates primarily in the infrasound range, below 20 Hz, and exhibits properties that suggest it was designed to induce specific neurological responses in listeners. Most troubling is that this pattern appears to self-replicate across different recording media, a phenomenon that violates known principles of audio physics. Chen's report continues with an observation that led to the premature termination of her research. When subjected to spectrographic analysis, These subharmonic patterns reveal organizational complexity suggestive of language, not random noise or simple tonal patterns, but structured information. Further, each subsequent generation of copying introduces subtle variations that appear to increase this complexity, as if the signal is evolving or being refined through iteration. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of Arnold Pearson, a former TVA worker who was present during the laboratory excavation. In a 1983 interview with a paranormal research publication, the only outlet that would publish his account, Pearson claimed that after the recordings were played, several members of the excavation team experienced severe psychological disturbances, insomnia, acute anxiety, and in one case, visual and auditory hallucinations that required hospitalization. Something was embedded in those recordings, Pearson insisted, something that affects the mind on a level we don't understand. That's why they sealed it all up, not just to cover up history, but because they were afraid of what Simmons had discovered, what he had somehow captured or created. Pearson's account might have been dismissed as sensationalism, if not for a curious detail that emerged years later. Employment records from the TVA showed that 6 members of the excavation team resigned within 3 months of the laboratory's discovery. 2 were later admitted to psychiatric facilities, and 1, Robert Halloway, vanished while on a solo hiking trip in the Cumberland Plateau in 1965. His backpack was found near the entrance to a cave system, but despite an extensive search, his body was never recovered. A journal found in Halloway's backpack, released to his family but never made public until 1990, contained troubling entries in the days leading up to his disappearance. "The voices are getting clearer," he wrote 3 days before he vanished. "Not just at night now, but during the day as well. They've started showing me images of where they are. A place that looks almost like our world, but wrong somehow. The angles don't make sense, and the light comes from no discernible source. They keep saying they've found the way through and need my help to widen the passage. I'm going to the coordinates they've given me. I know how this sounds, but I'm not crazy. They've proven their existence by telling me things they couldn't possibly know. Details about the lab we found, about Simmons and his work, about the recordings, things that were never in any report." The site of the laboratory discovery was flooded during the completion of the dam project in 1964. Whatever evidence remained now lies beneath the waters of the resulting reservoir. Occasionally, when drought conditions lower the water level significantly, portions of the old mining complex become visible, a literal resurfacing of a history that many would prefer to remain submerged. In 1965, historian Martin Calloway attempted to publish a comprehensive account of the Wilder case, compiling all available evidence and interviews with surviving witnesses. 3 publishing houses rejected the manuscript, citing concerns about factual verification. A small academic press finally agreed to publish a limited edition, but just weeks before the scheduled print date, a fire destroyed their facilities, including Calloway's only complete manuscript. Calloway himself suffered a severe nervous breakdown shortly thereafter and never resumed his research. A colleague who had reviewed portions of Calloway's manuscript later remarked on its methodical approach and scientific rigor. "This wasn't some sensationalistic ghost story," noted Dr. James Ferris of Columbia University. "Martin had constructed a compelling case that Thomas Simmons had discovered something fundamental about human perception, specifically how certain acoustic conditions might allow people to perceive aspects of reality normally filtered out by our sensory systems. The troubling implication was that these perceptions weren't hallucinations, but glimpses of something actually present, yet normally imperceptible." Perhaps most disturbing was Ferris's recollection of Calloway's theory regarding what happened to the Simmonses. Martin believed they had succeeded in creating what he called a persistent perceptual bridge, essentially a permanent connection to whatever lay beyond normal human perception. He suggested that they hadn't simply relocated but had somehow transitioned into this other state of perception so completely that they effectively existed in 2 worlds simultaneously. The evidence he presented was circumstantial but compelling. Reports of people encountering the couple briefly in various locations over the decades, always near sites with specific geological features similar to those found in Wilder, and always describing them as unnaturally aged or somehow transparent. Today the town of Wilder barely exists, a ghost of its former self. The mines closed permanently in the 1970s, and most residents relocated. The land where the Simmons house once stood is now part of an overgrown park, seldom visited and poorly maintained. A small plaque commemorates the mining history of the area, but makes no mention of Thomas or Margaret Simmons. Yet their story persists in academic circles concerned with the darker chapters of early psychological research. Some scholars suggest that Simmons's work represented an unauthorized extension of emerging studies in human psychology, a rogue scientist pushing boundaries that the established medical community was not yet ready to approach. Others propose more sinister motivations, pointing to references in his writings about weaponizing fear and the strategic applications of controlled psychological stress. What remains undisputed is that in the spring of 1911, something occurred in that small Tennessee mining town that authorities went to great lengths to obscure. The systematic destruction of evidence, the silencing of witnesses, and the classification of recovered materials all point to a truth deemed too disturbing for public knowledge. In 2002, during renovations to the Cumberland County Records Office, workers discovered a sealed envelope taped to the underside of an old filing cabinet. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age, showing a man and woman standing in front of a cave entrance. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Thomas and Margaret, New Beginning, 1911. The man's face is clearly that of Thomas Simmons, based on comparison with employment photographs from the mining company. The woman, presumably Margaret, is turned slightly away from the camera, her expression unreadable. The specific location of the cave has never been identified. What makes this photograph particularly intriguing is its apparent date, months after the couple's supposed disappearance. Its authenticity has been verified by photographic experts, suggesting that, contrary to speculation about their possible deaths, the Simmonses did indeed relocate as part of a deliberate plan. But to what purpose and under whose direction remains unclear. Adding to the mystery was the 2006 discovery of a series of pneumatic message tubes during the renovation of the Wilcox Mining Company's former headquarters in Nashville. These tubes, which allowed for the rapid transmission of written messages between offices in the days before telephones were common, had been sealed behind a wall sometime in the early 1920s. Inside one tube was a crumpled message dated April 2nd, 1911, approximately 2 weeks after the Simmons disappearance. It read simply, "TS confirms successful transition, threshold stability maintained. Proceed with Phase 2 funding. FW." The final piece of this disturbing puzzle emerged in 2014 when a collection of Frederick Wilcox's personal papers was donated to the Tennessee State Archives by his last surviving descendant. Among routine business correspondence and family documents was a sealed letter addressed to future generations, with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after his death. Wilcox had died in 1938, making the letter eligible to be opened in 1988, but it had apparently been overlooked among his effects. When archivists finally opened the yellowed envelope, they found a single page of handwritten text. The content was brief but chilling. I write this as a confession and a warning. What we attempted in Wilder was born of scientific curiosity, but blinded by ambition. Thomas believed he had discovered the mechanism by which fear physically reshapes the mind, creating pathways that connect our world to something else. What began as research became something I cannot describe even now. They are not dead, Thomas and Margaret. They went somewhere else. And sometimes, in my dreams, I hear them trying to come back. I have sealed the passage we found beneath the mines. I have burned the maps. May God forgive what cannot be undone. The letter was authenticated by handwriting experts as genuinely belonging to Wilcox, though many historians dispute its content as the ramblings of an elderly man possibly suffering from dementia in his final years. Yet one curious detail lends credence to Wilcox's account. His medical records, also included in the donated papers, indicate that from 1911 until his death in 1938, he suffered from a condition diagnosed as auditory neurosis. He repeatedly sought treatment for what he described as persistent sounds without external source. Multiple physicians prescribed various treatments, from sedatives to experimental therapies, all without success. In his final years, Wilcox reportedly lined his bedroom with cork panels identical to those found in the hidden laboratory, an apparent attempt to block sounds that only he could hear. A journal kept by Wilcox's night nurse in the last year of his life, discovered among his papers, describes disturbing episodes of what the nurse interpreted as nightmares or delusions. "Mr. Wilcox woke screaming again tonight," reads an entry from January 1938. "When I rushed to his room, I found him pressed against the wall, his ear to the cork paneling. 'They're getting closer,' he kept saying. 'Simmons was wrong. The passage works in both directions.' When I asked who they were, he looked at me with such terror that I felt my blood run cold. 'The listeners,' he said. 'They've been listening to us for so long. Now they want to do more than listen.'" In 2018, a research team from Vanderbilt University's Department of Psychological Sciences attempted to recreate some aspects of Simmons's work based on the fragmentary information available in declassified documents. Their focus was on the reported acoustic frequencies and their potential effects on human perception and psychology. The study was abruptly terminated after 3 months, with the lead researcher, Dr. Anita Sharma, citing methodological concerns as the reason. However, a graduate student who had worked on the project later claimed anonymously that the actual reason was far more troubling. "We began experiencing equipment malfunctions that defied explanation. Recording devices would capture sounds that weren't present during the sessions. Several participants reported identical nightmares involving figures watching from doorways that shouldn't exist. When we brought these concerns to the university's attention, the project was immediately shut down and all our data was confiscated. We were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that I'm violating by even telling you this much." Perhaps most disturbing was the students' claim that the research team had begun to isolate the same frequency described in Simmons's journals, 18.9 Hz, modulated with its third harmonic. "We were measuring the neurological response to this frequency when the strangest thing happened. All of our equipment registered a power surge, despite being on isolated circuits. And for just a moment, every person in the lab reported hearing a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It said only 2 words, 'Finally.' Connection. For those few who have studied the case in its entirety, the scattered evidence, the missing persons, the destroyed records, and the systematic effort to erase this history, a troubling question remains. What discovery in a small Tennessee mining town was so significant or so dangerous that even a century later the full truth remains obscured? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the flooded chambers beneath the reservoir, or in the sealed government archives that still classify portions of the recovered materials as too sensitive for public release. Or perhaps, as local legend suggests, the answer is still out there in the darkness of the Cumberland Caves, where even today spelunkers occasionally report strange sounds and inexplicable feelings of dread in certain unmapped passages. One such report, filed with the Tennessee Cave Survey in 2019, describes an experience that bears unsettling similarities to accounts from 1911. The anonymous spelunker wrote, "Approximately 300 meters into the northern passage, we began to hear what sounded like faint tapping, rhythmic, almost like Morse code, but with a pattern none of us recognized. As we moved toward the sound, we all experienced an increasing sense of dread that I can only describe as primal. Our equipment began to malfunction, lights flickering, compass needles spinning. We made the decision to turn back, but before we did, we all distinctly heard what sounded like a woman's voice coming from deep within the cave, though the words were indistinct. The most disturbing part was the unanimous feeling among our team that whatever made the sound was not simply producing noise. It was listening for our response. That same year, a digital audio recorder left in the cave system as part of a bat population study captured an anomalous sound sequence that audio specialists have been unable to explain. Beneath the expected ambient noise of the cave environment, a voice-like pattern is faintly audible. When enhanced and filtered, the words seem to be, "The door is almost wide enough now. We're coming through." Audio forensic experts have verified that the recording shows no signs of tampering or manipulation. The most terrifying aspect of the Wilder mystery may not be what we know, but what remains hidden. Like the silence that falls when you know someone is listening from the other side of a door that should never be opened. And perhaps that door, first discovered by Thomas Simmons in the dark mines of Wilder, Tennessee, has been slowly opening wider ever since, allowing something ancient and patient to peer through at us, waiting for the right moment to step across the threshold. As our journey into this disturbing chapter of Tennessee history comes to a close, one cannot help but wonder if the disappearance of Thomas and Margaret Simmons was truly an ending, or merely the beginning of something we have yet to fully comprehend. Something that continues to echo through the limestone passages of the Cumberland Plateau, sending ripples into our world like the concentric circles that spread when a stone is dropped into still water, or when something breaks the surface from below. The frequency is 18.9 Hertz. Perhaps it has always been there, just below the threshold of our hearing. Perhaps it is there now, as you listen to these words, gradually attenuating your perception to something that has been waiting patiently to be heard.